ship from the Philippines Navy was rammed by two ships from the Chinese Coast Guard. A few minutes later, a standoff ensues. China's Coast Guard is seen brandishing axes and knives. It happened at a shallow reef called Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines have a few soldiers stationed on a grounded ship. China also claims the reef, and in early 2024 began to prevent the Philippines from reaching it. When the Philippines made another attempt in June, the Chinese Coast Guard rammed them. This would be a minor incident if it weren't in one of the most contentious places on Earth.
And a storm is brewing in the South China Sea.
Another confrontation has taken place between Chinese and Philippine vessels.
It's the second such event in 2 weeks.
These giant ships are essentially playing chicken.
A high seas confrontation that could ignite a war.
6 countries claim parts of the South China Sea, and the competition is getting fierce.
You have fishers, you have these militia actors, you have multiple nations. There's a lot more variables, and there's a lot more chance that something unintended happens that you cannot de-escalate.
So what's driving up tensions in the South China Sea? What do all these countries want? And what is this conflict really about? In the South China Sea, the stakes couldn't be higher. Tens of millions of barrels of oil and gas sit below it. Shipping routes that carry $3.4 trillion in annual trade run through it, and its dwindling fisheries sustain millions of people. The Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, and Vietnam are each claiming rights to waters roughly up to 200 nautical miles off their shores. These exclusive economic zones are prescribed under international law. China has one too, but it's claiming a lot more. It illustrates its claim with this 9-dash line, something its government drew over 70 years ago.
They claim some form of historic rights, but what exactly they're claiming within that line has never been clarified.
I called Harrison Pratat, an expert on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea.
It's part of China's identity now to be a strong nation that does not cede its territory to others.
In fact, in 2023, China added a 10th dash next to Taiwan. But the problem with this line is that China's the only country that recognizes it. In 2016, an international court ruled that it has no legal basis. But that hasn't stopped China from trying to take control of it anyways. It's been occupying rocks and reefs all over the South China Sea, and even building new islands. In the Spratly Islands, 3 other countries have claims. But over the last decade, China piled sand onto reefs to build bases, complete with airstrips, weapons, and harbors for its ships. China uses them to extend its claim and support a huge fleet of vessels to enforce it. In 2014, it placed an oil rig within Vietnam's EEZ and sent dozens of ships there to prevent Vietnam from reaching it. Even as the Vietnamese protested, China didn't back down. In 2021, it ordered more than 200 fishing boats to dock at the unoccupied Whitsun Reef, leading the Philippines to worry that China was preparing to build on it, sparking a standoff that lasted for months until the boats left. China's message, though, was clear.
If it does not occupy, control, and exclusively exploit the South China Sea, then it should have the say over who does.
But today, its neighbors are fighting back.
So I've covered the South China Sea before, but this time when I dove in, everything had changed. New players, new locations, and the stakes were higher than ever. Thankfully, I was able to stay organized thanks to Ground News. That's a website and app that gathers stories from all over the world. And I love using it for complex stories just like this one. Take China's own efforts to expand its maritime boundaries. Thanks to Ground News, I'm able to see that over 70 outlets reported on it and filter them by political bias, recency, location, even government affiliation. Personally, I focus on sources with very high factuality in order to understand the deeper national interests and biases shaping the headlines. These tools tag every story and headline so you have all the context you need to dig deeper. And I love the interactive map feature that lets you explore news from anywhere in the world. With the second Trump administration starting, global hotspots like the South China Sea are more important than ever. So I use Ground News as my go-to for breaking news stories. And I also use it to keep track of my own media blind spots. If you're a fan of Search Party, this is the kind of thing you're into. And so here's the deal. Go to ground.news/searchparty or use this QR code and you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's what I use. It's great for anyone, again, who wants a clear understanding of the world. Thanks again for their support. Now I'll take you back to the South China Sea. So China's essentially been trying to overrule the claims of the other countries in the South China Sea, and each has been reacting to that in a slightly different way. I thought it'd be useful to rank them from the least to the most aggressive.
Taiwan and Brunei have essentially surrendered. Taiwan doesn't want to risk further conflict with China, while Brunei depends on China for most of its trade. Malaysia is typically quiet too, except for when it explores for oil and gas, whereas EEZ overlaps with China's 9-dash line. China protests, but Malaysia refuses to stop.
Malaysia tidak berganjak dari tuntutan dan pendirian kita tentang kawasan milik Malaysia, walaupun dibangkitkan oleh negara China.
Vietnam is going even further. It claims a number of reefs and islands and has begun to copy China's tactics. It's built this reef into an island base and greatly extended the size of 2 others. In fact, since 2022, Vietnam's reclaimed more land than China has. But for some reason, China hasn't stopped it.
Maybe they're putting a premium on those kind of party-to-party Communist Party ties in Vietnam and that relationship. To be honest, there has to be a Chinese response at some point.
It could be that China's too busy dealing with an even more aggressive adversary, the Philippines.
This country will not lose 1 inch of its territory.
When Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. took power in 2022, he reversed the Philippines strategy. His predecessor had mostly avoided talking about China's island building and activities in the South China Sea, but Marcos ordered his navy to start publicizing them. It began releasing videos showing how the Chinese Coast Guard shadows its ships, cuts them off, and even blasts them with water cannons. By publicizing China's actions, the Philippines hopes to form a common front with its neighbors and get sympathy from abroad. It also wants China to overreact. Sabina Shoal is claimed by both countries, but neither has built any permanent structures. When the Philippines docked a ship there in April 2024, Chinese ships surrounded it, then rammed it over and over until it was forced to leave.
China's kind of faced with an interesting decision is like, well, do we lighten up so that we don't look so bad in the international media? Or do we try to punish them harder because now they're trying to make us look bad? Essentially, they've sided on the second option every time.
That's exactly what happened in June 2024, when the Philippines sent a boat to resupply its men on 2nd Thomas Shoal, and China refused to let them. No incident in the South China Sea had ever come down to knives and axes. And while actual combat was avoided, one Philippine sailor did lose a thumb when the boats collided. This standoff illustrates exactly why tensions are rising in the South China Sea. For the first time, one country, the Philippines, is fighting back against China. And China's proving willing to escalate in order to stop them. After the fight, the 2 countries struck a deal. The Philippines could resupply its soldiers, but it couldn't repair the grounded ship. This deal will help diffuse tensions in the short term, but eventually, this ship's gonna have to be repaired, and that could lead to a more contentious standoff in the future. The problem is this is just one of several areas that the Philippines and China are contesting. And that's worrisome, because their conflict could involve more than just them.
The Republic of the Philippines, once an American possession, represents Cito's cornerstone on the east in Asia.
Since the Cold War, the United States has pledged to help the Philippines if it's attacked, and that includes attacks on, quote, public vessels. Meaning that any of these clashes could qualify as something the US is obliged to respond to. Remember the soldier who lost his thumb?
If that was his arm instead, maybe he bleeds out and dies, and then you have a US treaty ally who's just had a soldier die in a conflict with China in the South China Sea.
That's why many are worried about these incidents between China and the Philippines. They could easily lead to a conflict between China and the US. Afterwards, the US reiterated its support for the Philippines, and the Philippines clarified that it would not invoke the treaty. But this situation still leaves me with one big question. China's choosing to respond aggressively to the Philippines, but not any of the other countries. Vietnam is literally building islands, and China isn't saying anything, but it's cracking down in response to any move the Philippines makes, the one country backed by a superpower. I'm wondering if China is using these incidents with the Philippines to test the US's relationship with them. In addition to the South China Sea, it wants to take over Taiwan and ultimately have influence over all of East Asia. But it's currently constrained by the US and its allies in the region. By acting aggressively against the Philippines, China may be trying to demonstrate to the Philippines that the US doesn't necessarily have its back.
There's a logic for China that if they can demonstrate that the U.S. alliance does not help the Philippines, and that the only way to do that is to instead talk to China, make a deal, and kind of give up. They're hoping that this narrative can kind of prying the Philippines away from the U.S. But basically, so far, what we've seen is the opposite. The Philippine public, there's a large, overwhelming support for the U.S., and there's a lot of distrust in China.
Ultimately, what makes this region so dangerous isn't just the competition on the surface, playing out between these 6 countries, but the other one, between 2 superpowers below the surface.